Tarin Kowt, Uruzgan Province, Afghanistan, 2009. The forward operating base sits like a concrete scar on the desert floor, ringed with HESCO barriers and concertina wire. Inside the team room, the air conditioning wheezes against the 40-degree heat. A newly arrived SASR operator walks through the door, fresh from selection, his face smooth as polished stone. Clean-shaven, regulation compliant. Exactly what the Australian Defence Force manual demands. The room goes quiet. 6 operators look up from their weapons maintenance, from their mission maps, from their stained coffee mugs. The silence stretches like piano wire. These men look nothing like soldiers. Their beards hang thick and wild, matted with dust and sweat. Some braided, some reaching down to their chests. They wear their facial hair like armor, like battle flags, like proof of something the new arrival doesn't yet understand. One veteran finally speaks, his voice flat and cold as rifle steel. "You look like a cop." The words land like a slap. Another operator, his beard twisted with red dust, leans back in his chair. Can't trust a man who shaves in a war zone. Means he still thinks he's back in garrison. The new operator opens his mouth to respond, confused, defensive. But regulations say, he begins. The veteran cuts him off with a wave of his hand. Regulations. Grow a beard. Or sit in the FOB. We don't patrol with people who look like civilians. 6 weeks later, that same operator will walk through the same door, his face now covered with a scraggly, patchy attempt at facial hair. The stubble comes in uneven, thin in places, but it's there. The other operators nod. One veteran claps him on the shoulder. "Now you're starting to look like you belong here." The transformation has begun, but not just on his face. Something deeper is shifting, something that will take years to understand and decades to undo. But this was only the beginning of the horror. The Australian Special Air Service Regiment had always followed the rules. From 1957 through the Vietnam War, through East Timor, through decades of peacetime service, SASR operators looked like soldiers, clean-cut, professional, regulation compliant. The Defense Force dress manual was clear as crystal. Facial hair permitted, but it must be neat and tidy, well-groomed, trimmed to acceptable standards. Cannot extend below the collar line. Cannot interfere with equipment like gas masks or helmets. Most soldiers chose the easier path and stayed clean-shaven. Beards were rare, the domain of older officers or naval personnel. The cultural norm was simple as arithmetic. Military equals clean-cut. Vietnam changed nothing. SASR operators in the jungles of Southeast Asia remained mostly clean-shaven, save for the occasional mustache that reflected the fashion of the 1960s and 70s. There was no tactical reason, no cultural imperative, just personal preference. The 1980s and 90s brought peacetime garrison life, and beards remained scarce. Maybe 5 to 10% of operators maintained facial hair, always within regulations, always professionally maintained. East Timor in 1999 saw the first hints of change. Some operators grew beards in the jungle where shaving became difficult, but the practice remained scattered, insignificant, tactically unremarkable. Then Afghanistan arrived like a storm that never stopped. 2001, 2002, the initial SASR deployment hit Afghan soil with mixed grooming standards. Some operators bearded, most clean-shaven, nobody paying particular attention to facial hair as anything more than personal choice. But the operators began to notice something that would reshape their entire culture. Afghan men, particularly in Uruzgan Province, valued beards with religious and cultural intensity. In Pashtun culture, which dominated the region, a beard signified maturity, wisdom, authority, masculinity, trust. A clean-shaven man was a boy, weak, untrustworthy, beneath serious consideration. The Taliban made beards mandatory, viewing clean-shaven men as infidels, as enemies of God himself. The tactical realization came fast and hard. Bearded operators received respect from local populations. Village elders would speak to them, trust them, share intelligence that could save Australian lives. Clean-shaven operators got silence, averted eyes, stone walls of cultural rejection. The SASR, always adaptable, always focused on mission effectiveness, began to weaponize facial hair. By 2003, the beard culture emerged like a virus, spreading through the regiment, not through official orders, never through written policy, but through whispered conversations and knowing glances. Operators returning from Afghanistan came back bearded, and they kept their beards. New operators heading out were told, unofficially, to consider growing facial hair for cultural engagement. The percentage climbed. 30%, 50%, 70%. By 2006, the shift was complete. 90% of SASR operators in Afghanistan wore beards, and those who didn't face questions they couldn't answer. The horror wasn't in the beards themselves. The horror was in what they became. 2007, a joint patrol in rural Uruzgan Province. An SASR team accompanies an Australian Army infantry unit to meet with a village elder, seeking intelligence on Taliban movements. The infantry commander, a major, clean-shaven and regulation compliant, approaches the elder first. Professional courtesy, military rank, proper procedure. The elder refuses eye contact. His responses come through the interpreter in terse, monosyllabic grunts. 45 minutes of painful conversation yields nothing. The major grows frustrated, checking his watch, wondering why Afghan cooperation remains so maddeningly elusive. An SASR sergeant steps forward. His beard hangs thick and full, untrimmed for months, matted with the dust of the Hindu Kush. The elder's demeanor transforms like someone flipped a switch. Direct eye contact, relaxed posture, a smile that reveals missing teeth. They speak for 45 minutes through the interpreter, discussing family, crops, security concerns, the movement of armed men through the valley. The elder reveals locations of Taliban safe houses, patrol routes, supply caches, intelligence that will lead to 3 successful operations in the following week. The infantry commander approaches the sergeant afterward, bewildered and slightly angry. Why did he talk to you and not me? The sergeant's answer is brutal in its simplicity. Because I look like a man, you look like a child. To him, the lesson sinks in like a blade between the ribs. Beards equal instant credibility. Clean-shaven equals immediate distrust. The SASR adapts, as they always do, and the adaptation spreads like wildfire through the ranks. But the tactical effectiveness opened a door that nobody knew how to close. The psychological operations aspect became deliberate, calculated, weaponized. SASR operators didn't just grow beards. They cultivated a specific aesthetic designed to terrify and confuse the enemy. Long, untrimmed facial hair that made them look like Afghan fighters from a distance. Local clothing worn under body armor on certain operations. Basic Pashto phrases learned and deployed with deliberate effect. The goal was cultural mimicry, blending in at distance, becoming ghosts that could pass for armed locals until the moment of engagement. 2009. An SASR team establishes an observation post 400 meters from a suspected Taliban compound. They've been in position for 6 hours, motionless, watching through long-range optics. An Afghan herder walks past their position within 50 meters, his sheep bleeding and shuffling through the rocks. The herder glances toward the SASR position, but doesn't react, doesn't change pace, doesn't show any sign of alarm. He assumes they're local fighters, militia, men who belong in this landscape. 2 hours later, a Taliban patrol follows the same route. 8 armed men, scanning the hills, alert for Western forces. They walk within 70 meters of the SASR position and never break stride. The bearded operators, dressed in earth tones, wearing local scarves, remain invisible in plain sight. The operator who filed the report wrote a single assessment that would be repeated in debriefs and team rooms for years afterward. Beards saved our lives that day. If we'd been clean-shaven, we'd have looked Western. They'd have spotted us immediately. The tactical advantage was undeniable, measurable, written in blood, and successful missions. But tactical advantages can become cultural prisons, and the SASR was building one without realizing it. The intimidation factor became equally important. The warrior aesthetic, long, unkempt beards, worn, dirty uniforms with no garrison polish. Visible weapons carried openly, not concealed, broadcasting violence and capability. The combined effect sent a message that needed no translation. We are not regular soldiers. We are hunters. We have crossed a line you cannot see, and we will not cross back. A captured Taliban fighter, interrogated in 2011, provided testimony that intelligence analysts would study for years. The regular Australian soldiers, the ones without beards, we could fight them. But the bearded ones, they looked like us, like Pashtun warriors. We feared them more. The psychological impact was real, measurable, strategic. Clean-shaven Western soldiers represented soft, rule-following, predictable opponents. Bearded Western soldiers represented something else entirely. Adaptable, ruthless, willing to go native, to abandon the rules that kept other soldiers civilized. The unpredictability created fear, and fear created tactical advantage. But fear cuts both ways, and the SASR was beginning to fear themselves. The darker side emerged slowly, almost invisibly, like cancer growing in healthy tissue. As beards grew longer, SASR operators began to see themselves as fundamentally separate from the conventional military. The identity shifted from soldiers to operators, from members of the Australian Defence Force to members of a warrior tribe that existed outside normal hierarchies. Beards became the visual marker of this separation. Civilians couldn't tell rank from insignia, but they could see beards, and beards meant special forces, elite, dangerous, other. An operator, interviewed anonymously in 2015, provided a confession that would haunt the regiment's future. The beard wasn't just tactical, it was tribal. We were a tribe. The beard said, I'm not like them, like the regular infantry. I'm like us, like SASR. It created an us versus them mentality, and them included our own military. The dehumanization had begun, not of the enemy, but of themselves. They were becoming something other than soldiers, and the beard was the first visible symptom of the transformation. The horror deepened as the unwritten rule became law. 2006 through 2007, the beard remained optional, a personal choice, a tactical consideration left to individual judgment. No pressure, no enforcement. Do what works for you. Roughly 70% of operators chose to grow beards, recognizing the tactical benefits, but 30% remained clean-shaven without consequence. The culture was still flexible, still professional, still capable of tolerating individual difference. 2008 through 2009. The culture shifted. SASR leadership noticed the tactical effectiveness of bearded operators and began providing unofficial guidance. Consider growing a beard for cultural engagement. Not an order. Never an order. Just a suggestion delivered with the weight of command authority and operational experience. The percentage climbed to 80, then 85, then 90. Clean-shaven operators became rare enough to be noticed, questioned, marked as different. 2009 through 2011. Beards became expected. New arrivals were not ordered to grow facial hair, but peer pressure descended like a hammer. The team room conversations, the knowing looks, the subtle exclusions. Clean-shaven operators found themselves on the outside of informal hierarchies, the last to know about off-duty gatherings, the first to be assigned undesirable duties. The culture was enforcing conformity without official policy, making the rule unwritten but absolute. 2011 through 2013. The beard became mandatory through social enforcement. 90 to 95% of SASR operators maintained full beards. The 5 to 10% who remained clean-shaven faced consequences that ranged from social exclusion to career damage. The horror was complete. Not because of what was ordered, but because of what was never ordered. The rule existed in the spaces between words, in the silences, in the glances, impossible to fight because it was never officially acknowledged. The enforcement mechanisms were brutal in their subtlety. Social exclusion came first. A new operator arrived at Tarin Kowt in 2012, clean-shaven by personal choice. His skin reacted poorly to beard growth, prone to irritation and ingrown hairs that could lead to infections in the Afghan environment. Medical justification, reasonable explanation, it didn't matter. The first patrol briefing, the other operators barely acknowledged his presence. The post-patrol debrief, conversations flowed around him like water around a stone. 2 weeks of isolation, 2 weeks of eating alone, sleeping alone, existing alone in a team environment that demanded cohesion. The team sergeant finally approached him in the compound gym, lifting weights in silence before delivering the verdict. "Why don't you have a beard?" The operator explained about his skin sensitivity, the medical issues, the rational reasons for his choice. The sergeant's response was simple as a bullet. "So do I. Grow it anyway. You look like a pog. Person other than grunt." The most cutting insult in the infantry world applied to rear echelon support personnel who never see combat. The operator grew his beard despite the discomfort, despite the constant irritation, despite the minor infections that required antibiotic cream. The social acceptance improved immediately, dramatically, undeniably. His private conclusion, shared years later in anonymous testimony, revealed the true horror. The discomfort of the beard was less than the discomfort of being the outcast. Physical pain became preferable to social isolation. The culture had achieved complete control through mechanisms that left no paper trail, no official record, no avenue for complaint or appeal. Operational exclusion followed social exclusion like night follows day. SASR team leaders began preferentially selecting bearded operators for patrol assignments. The justification was tactical and therefore inarguable. Clean-shaven operators don't blend in with the local population. True enough on the surface, defensible in any after-action review. But the effect was devastating. Patrol assignments meant combat experience, which meant operational credibility, which meant career advancement. Clean-shaven operators got fewer patrol slots, which meant less experience, which meant slower promotion, which meant career stagnation. The statistics from 2011 tell the story. An SASR squadron deployed to Uruzgan Province with 60 operators. 5 remained clean-shaven for various reasons: medical issues, religious objections, personal choice. During the rotation, 20 high-value target missions were conducted. Desirable assignments, resume builders, career makers. Of those 20 missions, clean-shaven operators received 1 total slot distributed among all 5 operators. Bearded operators received 19 slots distributed among 55 operators. The mathematics are brutal. Clean-shaven operators had a 20% mission selection rate. 1 mission for every 5 operators. Bearded operators had a 34.5% mission selection rate, nearly double. Being clean-shaven reduced mission opportunities by approximately 40%. Not through official policy, not through written orders, through cultural enforcement that operated in the spaces where regulations don't reach. The questioning of masculinity and commitment became the final enforcement mechanism, the most toxic, the most personally damaging. Common phrases directed at clean-shaven operators became ritualized insults. You look like a REMF rear echelon motherfucker. Can't grow a beard? What are you, 12? We're in Afghanistan, not a parade ground. You here to fight or impress officers? The insults were delivered as jokes, wrapped in laughter, camouflaged as banter. But the message underneath was deadly serious. You don't belong here. You're not one of us. You're weak, inadequate, suspect. An operator who left the SASR in 2014 provided testimony that exposed the psychological damage. I couldn't grow a thick beard. Genetics. My facial hair came in patchy, thin. Other guys would mock it constantly. Nice pubes on your face. Did you glue that on? It was relentless. I started to feel like I didn't belong. Eventually, I requested transfer out. Not because I couldn't do the job. I'd passed selection, completed 2 deployments, proven myself in combat, but because I couldn't grow the right facial hair. The absurdity was crushing, but the reality was undeniable. Facial hair had become more important than combat effectiveness, and the culture couldn't see its own madness. The official policy and the unofficial reality existed in separate universes, never touching, never reconciling. The Defense Force dress manual remained clear throughout the Afghanistan deployment. Beards permitted, standards requiring neat, tidy, well-groomed appearance. Reality in SASR compounds was nothing like the manual described. Beards grew wild, unkempt, deliberately unmaintained for tactical effect. The contradiction was total, absolute, undeniable. But nobody with the authority to enforce regulations wanted to interfere with operators who were delivering results. An internal memo from the SASR commander in 2010 attempted to bridge the gap. Operators are reminded that grooming standards remain in effect. Beards, where grown, should be maintained to reasonable standards of hygiene and presentation. The memo was filed, read, and completely ignored. Because everyone knew what the squadron commander said unofficially, in conversations that left no record, in team rooms where regulations were theoretical abstractions. I don't give a fuck what the dress manual says. If you're clean-shaven in Uruzgan, you're tactically useless. Grow a beard or stay on the FOB. The contradiction became policy. The unofficial became more powerful than the official. And the horror grew deeper because nobody could fight an enemy that didn't officially exist. But the deepest horror was still ahead, waiting in the mirror. The psychological transformation happened in stages, predictable as sunrise, invisible until completion. Month 1 through 3, the operator grows a beard as a tactical tool. The mindset remains clear. This is temporary. For the deployment, a piece of equipment no different than body armor or night vision goggles. Identity remains stable. Soldier who happens to have a beard. Self-image unchanged. Month 3 through 9, the beard becomes part of daily life. The operator stops thinking about it as temporary. It becomes normal, natural, part of who they are in Afghanistan. The mindset shifts subtly. This is who I am here, in this place, doing this work. Identity begins to fracture. Not soldier anymore. Operator. Different. Separate. Elite. Month 9 onward. Identity fusion occurs. The beard becomes inseparable from self-image. The operator can't imagine themselves without it. Looking in the mirror without the beard would be like looking at a stranger, an imposter, someone else wearing their face. The mindset completes its transformation. I don't recognize myself without it. Identity has fully fractured. Not soldier, not operator, warrior. Something other than human. Something that exists outside normal rules and normal hierarchies. The mirror test became a common experience, reported by multiple operators across multiple rotations. End of deployment. Return to Australia. Required by garrison regulations to shave the beard that had defined their face for 6, 9, 12 months. The first shave in nearly a year. Looking in the mirror afterward. The reflection shows a stranger. A boy. Not me. The beard was me. Without it, I'm nobody. The psychological impact was measurable, clinical, documented in mental health assessments that would only become public years later. One case study reveals the depth of the horror. An SASR operator with 8 years of service, 3 Afghanistan deployments in 2008, 2010, and 2012. Beard grown continuously from 2008 through 2012. 4 years. Nearly half a decade of identity built on facial hair. 2012. End of 3rd deployment. Return to Australia. Required to shave per garrison regulations. The operator refuses. The conversation with the squadron commander is tense, uncomfortable, revealing. You need to shave. We're back in Australia. Regulations apply. The operator's response is quiet, almost pleading. I can't. The commander presses. Can't or won't. The operator struggles to articulate something he doesn't fully understand himself. Both. The beard is part of me. I don't know how to explain it. Shaving it feels like cutting off a limb. The commander, frustrated, falls back on the only tool he has. That's an order. Shave by tomorrow morning. The next morning, the operator complies. Shaves. Follows the order. But the psychological cost is immediate and devastating. First panic attack of his life. Heart racing, breath shallow, room spinning, convinced he's dying. Dissociation follows. Feeling disconnected from his own body, watching himself from outside, unable to recognize the face in the mirror as his own. Depression crashes down like a building collapse. Sudden onset. Severe. Debilitating. 2 weeks later, the operator requests psychological evaluation. The diagnosis is clinical, precise, horrifying. Identity disruption. The beard had become a core part of self-image, and removing it triggered an identity crisis. The operator literally didn't know who he was without facial hair. Treatment required 6 months of therapy, gradual rebuilding of self-concept, learning to separate identity from appearance. The outcome was partial success. The operator eventually adapted, but immediately requested permission to grow his beard again for the next deployment. Permission granted. The cycle continued. The psychologist's assessment entered the clinical literature as a case study in how tactical adaptations can consume identity. The beard wasn't just hair, it was his warrior identity. Removing it triggered an identity crisis. He didn't know who he was without it. The horror was complete. The tool had become the man, and removing the tool destroyed the man. The tribal marker aspect created in-group and out-group dynamics that would contribute to the regiment's eventual downfall. SASR operators with beards developed a collective self-perception. Elite, experienced, trusted, part of the warrior tribe. Peer perception reinforced this. One of us. Proven. Reliable. Public perception, from civilians to conventional military, saw bearded operators as intimidating, professional, the living embodiment of special forces stereotypes. The beard became shorthand for capability, for danger, for elite status. SASR operators without beards existed in a different reality entirely. Self-perception crumbled under constant social pressure. Trying to fit in, inadequate, not good enough. Peer perception was brutal. Not really one of us. New guy. Unproven. Even if they'd completed multiple deployments, even if they'd proven themselves in combat, the lack of facial hair marked them as outsiders. Public perception added another layer of doubt. Is he even SASR? Civilians expected beards. Military personnel expected beards. Anyone without facial hair faced constant questions about their legitimacy. The Brereton report in 2020 would identify this dynamic as a contributing factor to war crimes. The report's finding was clinical and damning. SASR developed insular culture characterized by warrior identity distinct from broader ADF. Visual markers, including beards and non-standard uniforms, reinforced separation. The analysis went deeper. Beards contributed to us versus them mentality. SASR operators saw themselves as different species from regular military. The consequence was predictable: reduced accountability. We don't follow their rules. We're different. We're special. The rules don't apply to us. The link to war crimes was correlation, not causation, but the correlation was undeniable. The Brereton report documented 39 unlawful killings between 2009 and 2013. The peak years of beard culture. The years when SASR operators most strongly believed they were warriors, not soldiers. The years when they most strongly believed the rules didn't apply. Beards didn't cause the war crimes, but the culture that made beards mandatory was the same culture that made war crimes possible. The aftermath arrived like a reckoning that nobody wanted to face. 2013, 2014, Afghanistan drawdown. SASR returns to Australia permanently. The expectation was clear: beards would be shaved. Operators would return to garrison standards, professional appearance, regulation compliance. The reality was different. Many operators refused. The beards stayed. The culture remained. The grooming standards battle raged from 2014 through 2016. The ADF position was unambiguous. Special operations personnel will adhere to standard grooming regulations when not deployed. The SASR cultural resistance was equally unambiguous. Operators argued that beards remained an operational necessity even in Australia. The reasoning was transparent. We might deploy again. Keeping the beard maintains readiness. The reality underneath was simpler and sadder. The beards had become identity, not tactic. and removing them felt like self-destruction. An unofficial compromise emerged. SASR operators were allowed to maintain beards in garrison, de facto policy that contradicted official regulations but kept the peace. The condition was nominal. Beards must be maintained, trimmed, clean, professional. The result was that SASR became the only Australian unit with widespread beards in peacetime. The separation continued. The tribe remained distinct. Then the Brereton Report detonated like a bomb in the center of the regiment. 2020. The war crimes investigation findings became public. Cultural factors were identified with surgical precision. SASR developed warrior culture separate from ADF values. Visual markers reinforce separation. Beards specifically mentioned as symbols of insularity. The recommendation was direct. SASR should reintegrate with broader ADF culture. Visual distinctiveness, including grooming standards, should be reduced. The ADF response came swiftly. New grooming directive from Special Operations Command. Beards permitted on deployment only. In garrison, beards must be shaved or maintained to strict standards far beyond the previous informal requirements. Commanders given authority to order shaving with no exceptions, no appeals. The SASR reaction was compliance on the surface, cultural backlash underneath. Operators shaved. Orders were followed. But the resentment ran deep as ocean trenches. Anonymous operator testimonies from 2021 through 2022 revealed the emotional damage. They made us shave after Brereton, like the beard was the problem, not the leadership that allowed war crimes. It was insulting. Another operator's perspective cut deeper. I shaved my beard in 2021. First time in 10 years. Felt like the Army was saying you're not special anymore. Maybe that's the point. Maybe we needed to hear it. A third operator's assessment was darkest. The beard ban is symbolic. They're trying to erase the Afghanistan era, SASR, but you can't erase culture by banning facial hair. The mindset remains. The current status as of 2024 shows partial cultural shift. Official SASR grooming policy is clear. Beards permitted during deployments with tactical justification. In garrison, must comply with ADF dress standards. Neat, trimmed, or clean-shaven. Enforcement is strict, a direct result of post-Brereton reforms. The reality shows change. SASR operators in 2024 maintain beards at approximately 40%, down from 90% pre-2020. The cultural shift is real. Beards are no longer mandatory identity markers. The new generation of operators who joined post-Brereton show less investment in beard culture. They never lived through the Afghanistan years. They never experienced the tribal enforcement. They're more ambivalent, more willing to follow regulations, less defined by facial hair. But the legacy persists in public perception and veteran identity. Special Forces still equals bearded in popular imagination. The stereotype persists despite regulatory changes. Clean-shaven operators are still sometimes disbelieved, questioned, forced to prove their SASR credentials. Older operators, Afghanistan veterans, still associate beards with elite status. The tribal marker remains powerful in their minds. Younger operators navigate between the old culture and new regulations, uncertain which way the future lies. The Horror Explained reveals layers of dysfunction. Surface level, the horror is social pressure to conform. Operators forced to grow beards despite discomfort, medical issues, personal preference. Ostracized if clean-shaven. The horror comes from conformity enforced through peer pressure rather than official policy, making it impossible to fight through normal channels. No orders to disobey. no regulations to challenge. Just cultural weight pressing down like atmosphere, invisible but crushing. Deeper level, the horror is identity consumption. The beard starts as a tactical tool, a piece of equipment, a temporary adaptation. It becomes identity. Operators become unable to separate self from facial hair. The horror comes from watching the tool consume the user. Losing part of your body, just hair, triggers psychological crisis. The boundary between person and appearance dissolves. The beard becomes the man, and removing it destroys the man. Deepest level, the horror is tribal dehumanization. Beards mark the warrior tribe as separate from normal humans. Operators see themselves as different species. The horror comes from cultural evolution creating monsters. Men who see themselves as above rules, above humanity, above accountability. The beard becomes evidence that they've crossed a line that cannot be uncrossed. They've become other, and once you become other, there's no path back to human. The paradox remains unresolved. Beards made SASR more effective. Better cultural engagement with Afghans who trusted bearded operators. Tactical advantage through blending in and intimidation. Team cohesion through shared identity markers. The benefits were real, measurable, written in successful missions and saved lives. But beards also contributed to SASR's downfall, reinforced insularity and separation from the broader ADF, became symbols of exceptionalism and the belief that normal rules didn't apply, were linked to war crimes culture in the Brereton report findings. The damage was equally real, equally measurable, written in unlawful killings and cultural collapse. The question cuts like a knife. Were beards a tactical adaptation that went too far? Or were they a symptom of deeper cultural problems? The answer is both. Beards started as smart tactics. Cultural awareness, psychological operations, effective engagement with local populations. They became tribal markers, visual symbols of separation, evidence of cultural drift. They ended as proof of toxic culture. The Brereton report cited them as symbols of the insularity that enabled war crimes. Comparative context shows how unique the SASR experience was. U.S. Navy SEALs grew beards in Afghanistan and Iraq for similar reasons: cultural engagement, intimidation, team identity. But beards never became culturally mandatory. Clean-shaven SEALs were not ostracized. Post-deployment, most SEALs shaved and returned to garrison standards without psychological crisis. U.S. Army Special Forces, the Green Berets, commonly wore beards. Their culture embraced facial hair, but the difference was official policy. Special forces were allowed beards for cultural operations through formal regulations. The enforcement came from command, not peer pressure. This cultural impact remained manageable. Beards were normal, not identity markers. British SAS maintained beards on deployment, but they had historical tradition. The SAS always had relaxed grooming standards, dating back to World War II. The cultural impact was minimal. Beards were normal, expected, unremarkable. Not tribal markers, not identity fusion, just tradition. The SASR was different. For US and UK Special Forces, beards were tools, tactical choices. Identity remained separate from facial hair. For SASR, beards became identity, tribal markers. Operators couldn't separate self from beard. The result was psychological fusion of tactic and identity that proved uniquely destructive. Why this happened uniquely to SASR requires examination of multiple factors. Cultural isolation played a role. SASR was a small unit, approximately 300 operators total, deployed to remote, isolated areas in Uruzgan Province. The result was insular culture developing with no external checks, no outside perspectives, no moderating influences. Length of engagement was crucial. SASR maintained continuous presence in Afghanistan for 12 years, from 2001 through 2013, long enough for beard culture to calcify. Generations of operators rotating through, each one reinforcing the culture, making it stronger, harder, more resistant to change. Lack of oversight enabled the drift. SASR operated with minimal command oversight due to special operations autonomy. The result was cultural drift going unchecked. Beard culture became extreme without anyone with the authority to intervene, noticing or caring until it was far too late. The final assessment reveals the complete arc of the horror. What started as tactical adaptation in 2001 became tribal enforcement by 2011. Smart cultural awareness and psychological operations became toxic social exclusion and identity consumption. The tactic ended as cultural evidence. The Brereton report in 2020 cited beards as symbols of insularity. The horror is that the tactic that made SASR effective became the symbol of their moral failure. The numbers tell the story with brutal clarity. SASR operators with beards in 2001, approximately 10%. In 2005, approximately 50%. In 2010, approximately 90%. In 2015, post-deployment but still high, approximately 85%. In 2021, post-Brereton crackdown, approximately 40%. In 2024, as cultural shift continues, approximately 35%. The horror summarized requires listing the mechanisms of cultural destruction. Clean-shaven operators were seen as untrustworthy because cultural weapons became tribal law. Beards started tactical, became mandatory through enforcement that left no paper trail. Identity fusion made operators unable to separate self from facial hair. Shaving triggered psychological crisis, panic attacks, dissociation, depression. Social enforcement operated through peer pressure instead of official policy, making it insidious and impossible to fight. Operational exclusion gave clean-shaven operators fewer missions, damaging careers through cultural bias rather than official discrimination. Masculinity questioning made inability to grow beards equal to inadequacy, weakness, failure as a warrior. Psychological dependence created situations where removing facial hair destroyed self-concept. Beards symbolized separation, marking SASR as other, as not regular military, as different species. Cultural insularity reinforced us versus them mentality that contributed to war crimes culture identified in Brereton report. Resistance to reform showed operators refusing to shave post-Afghanistan because identity had become too fused with appearance. Legacy damage made beard culture itself become evidence in war crimes investigation, the tactical adaptation becoming proof of cultural failure. The closing thought requires examining one operator's journey through the horror. 2008. An SASR operator grows a beard to talk to an Afghan elder. It works. The elder trusts him. Intelligence is gathered. Lives are saved. The tactic is effective. The mission succeeds. Everything is justified. 2012, 4 years later. That same operator can't shave without having a panic attack. The beard has consumed him. The tactic has become his identity. He doesn't know who he is without facial hair. The tool has eaten the user. 2020, 8 years later. Investigators cite that beard and thousands like it as evidence of a culture that lost its way. The Brereton report documents war crimes, cultural insularity, Separation from ADF values. The beards are listed as symbols, visual markers of the tribal mentality that enabled unlawful killings. The tactic has become evidence of moral failure. The horror of the SASR beard regulation isn't that operators grew beards. The horror is that they forgot why. The tactic became the identity. The tool became the tribe. And when they were finally forced to shave, some operators discovered they didn't know who they were underneath, because the beard wasn't just hair. It was proof they were willing to become something other than human. And once you cross that line, you can't cross back. Not even with a razor, not even with reform, not even with a war crimes investigation that exposes everything you became. The beard grows back. The humanity doesn't. That's the horror nobody wanted to admit.